Welcome to session 4, all about housing. This may be one of the sessions you are most excited about, partly because of its contribution to Canada's national housing strategy, and a shout out to our sponsors, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and also partly because you believe housing development may be one of the best ways of unlocking value on your church property.
We're super excited to have friend, he's a developer for Thea Partners, Rodney Wiltz, with us here today.
He's a legend, actually.
He is a legend. And he's helped us a lot to understand the ways in which property development can help a congregation as a path forward to mission in the community and the neighborhood in which it's in.
So Rodney, imagine that you are at a pub with us, okay? We're Jeff, we're Jane. I'm not going to say which one is more Jane or Jeff. Okay, so you're here with an experienced leader in the community. They are on the board of their church, and they say to you, Rodney, I'm a smart person. I understand how a lot of things work. I think I know roughly what property development is, but just for the avoidance of any doubt, just so I don't embarrass myself, can you go back and just explain to us, what is property development? Who are the characters involved? What happens in the processes of property development? Let's just do this back of the napkin version for a smart person. What is property development?
Sure, great. It's a tough and loaded question. First of all, let me say I'm excited to be here with two of my favorite people. The work you guys are doing is incredible. What is property development? To me, property development starts with optimizing the property. How do we get the highest and best value out of this property? And we'll talk later about, value. And I know you have a session coming up on value on a whole number of different levels. So I'm not going to unpack that too much right now, but it's about just looking at a property and saying, how can I strategically create the most value out of this particular property?
And we're going to define terms as we go along. You are referring to a technical term in the property sector called highest best use, and that's that's a really technical piece. It's meant to be not very scientific, right? You should be able to sit down and everybody would agree. And isn't it the case, Rodney, that if you could build a 40-story condo tower on a piece of property, that's generally going to get you the most money, and that's what's going to get called highest best use? Is that right? Or how can people understand that?
Yeah. Hey, it's not always right. Every once in a while, I'll see a crazy proposal of some, rural community, and there's a developer, and they say they're going to do a 40-story condo tower, and there's no market for it.
In the middle of the village.
The middle of the village, right? That's a recipe for disaster, right? So I would say the answer to that is no. The answer is not always, 40-story condo tower.
Is it always commercial or residential, and what are those things?
It's not always commercial or residential either, right? Development is very context specific, right? And it could be that your community, your property, that neighborhood is just screaming for seniors housing, that there's just a dramatic lack for seniors housing. The entitlements you're going to be able to get, the permission from the local government for the city for seniors housing might be a lot more generous than you would get for instance, to do a condo tower.
Rodney, entitlements. Hold on, there's another term to define. What does that mean?
Well, there's often this misperception. You see it all the time, social media, et cetera, that say, oh, these developers, they get away with anything. They do whatever they want to do. The reality is, for any piece of property, there are a series of existing entitlements. Zoning, maybe a secondary plan, official plan that tells you what you can and cannot do on any particular piece of property.
And that's these entitlements come from the municipality and the province, right?
Yeah, it direction flows down from the province down to the municipality, but the actual zoning, the secondary plan, that would be a municipal document.
Okay, so this is one of the things that developers do. They get entitlements, right?
Right.
And do entitlements really change the property? Do they change the value?
Absolutely, 100%, really. And I know we're speaking at a high level, but I think it's helpful in this context to just think about a church as a for instance, and think about a parcel that's sitting there that's 2 acres, and it's probably zoned for institutional use. It's zoned for church gathering, public gathering space. It probably has a limited height entitlements in terms of how tall you can build on that front, and you couldn't go in and do housing. You couldn't go in and do a commercial office
Because there are no entitlements on that site.
because there are no entitlements on that site.
Even when all the other properties, for instance, around that church, they all have those entitlements. Doesn't that mean that the church automatically has them?
It's not automatic, no. And in fact, in some cases, that you might even have a series of other overlays. You might be in a heritage district that even if your building's not designated, you're in a district that has limitations in terms of what you can or cannot do, as a for instance, right?
So can you just not write a letter to the mayor and ask for these entitlements?
I wish it were that easy. I wish no, you could, because
What if you take the mayor out for coffee, a really good coffee? Would that work?
unfortunately, no. I mean, the
Does the
reality,
mayor even give these entitlements?
the mayor, yes and no. Okay, you're going to hear that a lot. There's a lot of nuance in the development world. The mayor themselves, of course, does not give entitlements. It's got to typically, and jurisdictions work a little bit differently across the country, but more or less how it works is initially you are dealing with staff, city staff, and they have guidance, right? So they have an official plan, a secondary plan that sort of says what should go on in that general neighborhood, what should not go on in that general neighborhood, right? That's how that looks. You go into staff. I would go into staff and sort of say, listen, we're looking at this property. We think it has an opportunity to be office or community hub or residential or housing. They then give you a long list of studies that they want you to do, typically, right? And
Let's list what those studies
Yeah,
are.
let's
so that oftentimes
Because people would love to just have that on the back of a napkin, right?
Sure.
They pulled out the old plan of the church. They wrote on there residential community hub, and they really hope that the city would just say, that sounds great.
sign me up.
So no, there's a whole list of things. What are those things?
Well, typically, not to stereotype too much, but the bigger the city, the longer the list.
Whoa.
Generally.
Okay.
So if you're in small town, you know, those entitlements in Wawa might be a little bit easier than they might be in Toronto or Vancouver,
Understood.
as a for instance. But the kinds of studies that the city is going to be looking for would be a transportation study. What are the impact? You're going to do a redevelopment. What's the impact going to be on traffic patterns and parking and those kinds of things? The study, they're going to look for a servicing study. So what are you going to do for water, sewer, hydro? You know, like how are those going to plug in? Is there sufficient capacity in the neighborhood to handle this kind of new development? They're going to be looking for things like wind studies, noise studies, geotechnical studies. These are
A
all,
lot of money for these studies.
it's a lot.
Do they just
of
give
money.
us money? Does the city give money so we can get those studies done?
See, I love the Graham universe here, where the city gives you money and you just take a mayor for coffee. No, unfortunately, that's not the case at all.
And these are not like $1,000 or $2,000. These studies. These are $10,000, $15,000 plus dollars each one of these things you just said.
That's right, yeah.
Right.
And you're going
And
to
that you didn't even say the site survey.
the sites,
need that
the
too,
site survey,
right.
absolutely. You're going to almost certainly need a planning rationale. So you need the planner
money,
who's going to
Rodney.
come in, and you need the architect who's ultimately going to show you what the concept is going to be.
What if the architect has no idea what we're going to do? What if they just come up with plans that we haven't even agreed? We haven't even sat down and talked about that.
Well, you know, this is typically
It's
where
complicated,
where
right? I mean-
this is typically the role the developer plays. I have two daughters who are going to be 16 and 18 this upcoming summer. And when they were younger, it was always very confusing for them, because they would sort of say, "Oh, Dad, you design buildings." No, I don't really design buildings. You know, I'm not the architect. The architect's the one who draws the building. Oh, well, you build buildings. No, I don't actually build. You know, we a contractor does it. Well, what is it that you do? But
what do you do, Dad?
But the developer, you know, is certainly dealing
Because
with
the churches they have this exact same question. They think you're like the Wizard of Oz,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So keep going.
And I was in a meeting with the community association the other day, and they were trying to distill, what is it that the developer does? You know, like, are you the Wizard of Oz? It's funny that you mentioned that analogy, because are you the Wizard of Oz behind that curtain? But I prefer to use the analogy about kind of the conductor of the orchestra, right?
Yeah.
You know, that you have a lot of talented team players,
Yes.
and you're trying to make
Yes.
sure that they're singing together.
This is a great problem with the metaphor, isn't it? Because the conductor of the orchestra has a score. There is a concerto that's
Yes,
been written.
right,
They
yeah.
know exactly which way it's going to go. And the composer has taken maybe 10 years of their life to write that score.
Right.
The developer, you're having to write this score as you go along, because each of those reports that comes in is now giving a different result, right? So,
Sure.
so let's go back to this. The developer now is the city told you need all these different reports. So now the developer has to figure out, how do I get those reports done in a timely way, where if you come up with a problem that you haven't gone and spent money with the architect, for instance, if you realize there's a big problem with sewage, that's going to throw the whole thing off, or the groundwater now will not allow for parking to go deep enough to build as high as you want.
Yeah.
So this orchestra that you're conducting, it's complicated, right?
It is complicated. Now, what I would say is iterative, and you do have to start with a concept. You can't go and say to a transportation consultant, I just want a general transportation study. The transportation engineer is going to look at what is the concept you're introducing. So if I'm going to be introducing 500 new homes, as a for instance, that's going to have different transportation impacts than if I'm doing a 25-unit seniors home.
Yes.
Right? Those are going to be very, very different kind of transportation impacts. So you do have to start with the concept. And so the developer, not to belabor this analogy too much, but the developer working with the landowner is going to come up with a concept in terms of what they think is going to optimize value on the site. And we're going to start with a very high level design. The architect, your planner start with a very, very high level, site plan and design. And then these studies start rolling.
Yes.
And when these studies start rolling, you are likely going to iterate that concept. Are there servicing considerations that make you, potentially want to shift the building here or there? Are there geotechnical considerations that sort of like, if you put that building there, that, there's a fault line, it's going to cost a lot more if you shuffle it over here.
So this is what we wanted to get into in this session, because we want people to understand, not with a developer trying to pitch them on an idea, which, as you know, and you've taught us, Rod, you taught Dave and I, it's not a good idea generally to have a developer being the first interface with the church, because they haven't yet understood what they want. We really believe that vision should be informed by having deeply listened to the neighborhood, because often we understand churches are wanting to do the work of reconciliation. They're wanting to see their church or their faith community grow in the future. They need that time to understand where they're going so that they can map this on, because they want assurances from the developer, right? They want a fixed price. They want to know that you're going to just deal with the city and all these things. But the reality is, you're having to work with the municipality on all of these pieces. You're responding to these studies as they come in. You're managing the cash flow to make sure you don't just say, we want all these studies, here's $200,000, bang, let's get it all done. So now we're in this interplay. Okay, so let's go back. You're there with the municipality. You've got your laundry list of work. The church is kind of in the background with what they hope will happen out of this, all of which you're doing something called a proforma, right? I love the phrase, Dave and I joke about this sometimes. We say a good developer has done the proforma on a property before they even get out of their car.
Sure.
Right? You're that kind of guy.
Right.
You're in your car, you drive up to a site, and you're already running the math. You're doing that thing like a ninja, right? How important, what exactly is a proforma, and why is it so important right at the beginning of these conversations?
Sure. A proforma, basically, from the highest level, is
By the way,
a
do you spell it
spreadsheet.
as 2 words, or do you
I
always
spell
want
it as
one word?
I spell
I'm
it
always
as 2
confused
words.
by it.
I spell it as 2 words, but
Right. So, okay,
that's how
go ahead.
I've seen it.
So
But
pro forma. All right. What is
a
that?
proforma, it is a spreadsheet, a large spreadsheet from the highest level, detailing the costs you're going to incur and the revenue you're going to achieve,
Okay.
and the cash flow over time.
Right.
Sounds simple.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It sounds simple, but as we're
I always
already
like
on
the title page of these things. It's all those other tabs. They're really scary, and they go way off into the distance, right?
Especially something like a rental property where
Yeah.
you might have you might
Title
hold it.
page is great, right?
The title page, a summary, and it will, a pro forma will also indicate what kind of returns you're planning on
Yes.
achieving.
Because let's go to the returns. Okay, let's imagine that you have to put $250,000 to $300,000 of real pre-development, what you just described there. That money needs to go in. We could find at the end of that the project can't work. So that money could get lost, couldn't it?
Well, absolutely. And a full rezoning exercise can easily cost anywhere from $250,000 to $750,000.
Okay.
And it's not uncommon at all for that to be $500,000.
Okay.
And
So that's risky.
that is risky money. There's always an opportunity, even if the project pencils, even if the project is viable. So that's a developer lingo. If you say that the project pencils, that means the math equation on that pro forma works. You have a viable, financially viable project, but you might not get the zoning and entitlements to be able to do it. So, or you might, on the other hand, get the zoning and entitlements, but the math won't support the project. And for us, one of the things you had referenced in that earlier question about, a guy like you is starting with the pro forma. And we absolutely, I can't claim that I'm doing it before I'm out of the car. Off the bike.
Yeah, off the bike.
Before I'm off the bike.
Rodney does that.
But before I'm off the bike, we're definitely thinking that way. And certainly, before we are engaging all of these consultants, before we're spending all that money, we have a conceptual pro forma that says, yes, we think this project can work.
So this is so important because now we're talking about, you have to go and find, or somehow we have to go and find those hundreds of thousands of dollars of pre-development money. That is, in a sense, the smallest amounts of money out of the whole thing, because it could be tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to actually build whatever this development is. It could be commercial, residential, mixed use, seniors, students, all of those different things we discussed. There could be a community hub back in this new property. It could be a development next to a heritage church building where we have a little parcel of land that could be developed. That's hundreds of millions. So we think, a lot of people I think that's the harder part. But in fact, isn't it the case? It's this first part that's the hardest. So now you have to go, or we have to find that money. And it's exciting when you think about Canada, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, another shout out to our sponsors. And, they have come up with innovative programs, which we are connected with. There's the CMHC Co-Invest program. There's the SEED program, which is a slightly different program. And there are other ways in which a government organization can help. We're involved with a number of provinces where the province wants to help. And in some cases, the municipality wants to help. They love to help once the project is ready for construction. It's harder to get them to do this. So now when we talk about returns, this isn't the developer trying to make loads of money, we'll talk about that in a second. But really, they have to convince wherever they're getting that money from that this is possible, right? So that, if the church is involved now, they're putting in, let's say that they want to contribute the land that they have. Do they take the same risk? So if let's say the pre-development process doesn't work, let's say the developer walks away and the church walks away. How bad, how good? Just talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Lots to unpack there.
Obviously, this is under the proviso that all of this is not legal advice. This is not specific property advice. You happen to be a lawyer, Rodney, but this is under hypothetical situations that what we're talking about now is into the depths of a hypothetical deal, which can go in lots of different ways. But in general terms, what are we talking about?
Absolutely. If you're thinking about doing this, go see a real lawyer, right? And a real accountant.
But not too soon before you figure this out. Right?
That's right. Yes.
Because this is the structure we're trying to figure out.
Yeah. So in terms of unpacking a number of different things that you say, is that pre-development funds the highest risk money? Absolutely. It's the hardest to find. It's the highest risk because it can go to zero. Now, does that mean that for a church, if they were to put their land into the deal, as for instance, is the church, potentially on the hook? Now, there's 1,000 different ways a deal can be structured. Typically, these kinds of things are structured in such a way that the real estate deal does not close until you have the entitlements in place. So, i.e., in a typical scenario, and there is no typical for there's as many different ways to structure as a deal as there is different ways that people do church in this country. But typically a deal would not close until you have zoning in place, and so in that case, the church would still be left with their land, but they've burned a number of years potentially through that process.
So this is a real this is a difference in risk. The developer under that approximate circumstance has taken more risk. They could lose
Absolutely.
$500,000. The church
Yes.
could say, okay, we didn't make it. We're struggling to go, but at least we'll just keep on struggling, right?
Right.
Or it could be a little further along where the church has actually contributed its land there and puts its land at risk, and they risk having perhaps a lien on their property or that kind of thing.
Sure.
So often the churches are trying to navigate their own risk in this. And this is, I think, don't you think, Dave, when we look at how these conversations normally get stopped, right? When we're in with Jeff and Jane, so in the church board meeting, Jeff and Jane kind of get where this is going. But quite a few other members of the board, they're lost at this point, right? They're worried. They're thinking, hold on a minute. Why don't we just sell our property? Let's just sell it. Let's move to another church. Because this is complicated. But the fact is, it is complicated. It is risky. This is beyond what any church board normally deals with. Right?
Certainly.
They probably never in the history of the board of this church have they ever faced this question. Right?
And Ron, you mentioned years. So what is the timeline? What is the process involved in a development process? The church is sitting there going, we got 8 months, 6 months, a year left. We should really think about doing something.
Because there's a hole in the roof and there's no money left.
Where there's
in the
no
bank.
money left in the budget. So often I think churches think about development or the possibilities too late. But what is the timeline? What is the process?
Absolutely. Development is a slow moving train.
And especially with churches.
And especially it's a slow moving train.
Slow-moving train, and then
Even
you
when you don't have volunteer boards
Then you
involved,
add volunteer
right? And then you
boards.
add volunteer boards, and in some cases you add volunteer boards who then have to report up to the congregation, and then the congregation has to report up to a presbytery or a diocese. So it just adds additional whole layers on that front. I'm gonna talk about the timelines in a second, because I did want to just mention the risk piece.
Yes.
The reality is development does entail risk.
Yes.
Nothing great has ever been done without taking on some kind of risk.
Yep.
And
sure.
if you really want to optimize returns, and when I say that, I mean social returns, environmental, spiritual returns, and financial returns.
Yep.
There is always a corollary between risk and returns, right? We always, in the development world, we always talk about risk-adjusted returns.
Anytime we're going to do something new, reimagine something that doesn't exist, it's going to take risk
It will
to
take
get
risk.
to what that impact is that we desire.
Right.
And I know we're moving into this, this is the conversation we wanted to have. Another sidebar, which is another place people get lost, is they have somebody on the board, quite rightly, who says, aren't we a registered charity? Are we allowed to take these risks?
Right.
And perhaps that's an accountant who says, I'm not so sure that a charity can take the same risks as a for-profit development company.
Right.
And again, another disclaimer, this is not legal advice on which you can rely, but it has been our experience, and we have learned from other experts. There are some limits to what a registered charity can do. And there is a good argument to say, actually, yes, we have a property that's worth $5 million today. If we ride this out and things go well, and I love these investment memos that literally say, if things go well, A, B, C, D. If things don't go well, X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
It could be that a church board decides, if things go well, our $5 million property could be worth 10 million to us. And we would look at the value we have and say it's now worth 10 million. Or we get a check today for 4.8 million. And we think, well, we could have had 5. And the developer or the investors say, well, we're taking the risk, so we may not offer you the maximum price, or maybe we offer you the fair market price, or maybe there's a sale. Maybe it goes out with a real estate broker. But now at that point, once the property is sold, it's sold, right? It no longer belongs. The church is now out. So isn't it the case that a registered charity, I guess I'm answering my own question, a registered charity and the board of such an organization may well say, we're not sure that it's right for us to take that risk. So this is a challenge a lot of churches face, right? So let's go back and make sure we get so we've gone from highest best use, and that in itself not easy to define. We're now going for entitlements. This is the big point at which The value of the property is going to change, but it's also very risky. It's long. Now the developer would go out and find a construction consultant. And sometimes we see churches that come with a constructor already on board. And we think, well, that's a bit odd that you have the constructor, because do they want to do that process, and are they actually the right builder? Or sometimes they'll tell us, we want to do modular housing or this kind of environmentally friendly. And often we end up saying, and you're quite right to reference it, Rodney, and you know, because you've helped us on this, often we'll say to churches, when it comes to that level of detail, you need to focus on that pencil mark first before you think you can get all of those different things. And Dave, you referenced that. So now let's say that they had a plan, they had the entitlements, they began to have the drawings of what that looked like, those were accepted, you have a builder. Now, some of that, and I want to get just to the end and then we'll circle back. At the end of that, let's say it's $100 million construction for a certain number of housing units.
Right.
Some of that can be borrowed as debt from an organization like Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Some could be bank debt, but some is money that it's cash that they have to have in, right? Which is known as equity.
That's right. Yes.
So there are investors here. Those investors now are determining, and they want to make sure their interest is to get a financial return. And the church, to some extent, they've put their land in. So if they've sold it, they're out. If they put their land in and they become a co-investor into this property, they also have a certain interest in the financial return. Now the thing is built and it's either sold, the condo units, let's say, are sold, or the building is rented. Is that's kind of the end of the development process, right? So if we're back to the 101, from the beginning of the concept to somebody now lives or works in the property which has been built. When you look at that, Rodney, what have you seen when a church approaches this well? What are some of the features? And I know, Dave, we have a couple of questions on this. When a church really gets this right, what are some of the things that help prepare them? What does right look like for a church in your experience?
Okay.
That's a huge question.
What does right look like for a church? Certainly from my experience, what makes it infinitely easier is if the church knows where they're aiming for. And Dave has referenced this concept before of the laundry list. I've certainly had lots of interactions with churches where I've went in and had the conversation, and they say, we want deep affordable housing, we would like a community hub, we'd like to maintain every parking spot or double the number of parking spots we have, we want a new kitchen. And
we didn't make up this laundry list. We see the same list every time.
It's often the same list.
Oftentimes the same list. And so...
and you use the phrase that development doesn't do everything.
That's right.
Like it's this, they come with this list and you look at it, okay, you're wanting all the things. We want to do affordable housing, we want to keep the parking lot, we want to meet our budget deficit, we want to do it all. What does development do? How can development help as they clarify their objectives? What questions are they asking as they're clarifying what really is a priority for them?
Right, and that's where it comes back to...
Because can it help fix the church? Can it help make everybody come back to church? Can it do, because they were hoping, the church is hoping that that will also
All
happen,
the young
right?
families come back.
Everybody will be convinced that Jesus is alive because of how well they developed this building.
Right.
They're hoping that.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. And I always try and stay out of that. I'll be honest. That's your business on that front. But certainly where it's very helpful is if a church absolutely knows what their priorities are going in. So let's say, for instance, if a church says, no, we'd like a revenue stream, but that's so far down on our priority list. What our absolute priority list is deep affordable housing. That's what we want to deliver to this community. And if we end up vanishing because of it, that's okay. That's fine. That's great.
Because
then
we've left some behind that is making an impact in the
That's right.
community. We're meeting a need.
That's beautiful. But that's a very different partner than a church coming in and sort of saying, what we'd like to do, what we need to do here is we need to create $100,000 a year in revenue to sustain ourselves.
Yep.
And
We hear that a lot.
Yeah.
and
To pay the
some
minister.
some of the nice things we'd like to have would be a better church facility, and one of the nice things to have would be a showpiece for environmental sustainability, etc. Then it becomes a lot easier. We talked about that concept. The developer has to come up with a concept that's going to feed all those kinds of studies. It's a lot easier to come up with that concept that's going to resonate with the church, that's going to be appropriate for the church, that's going to deliver the value the church wants to see, if they can be very, very clear out of the gates what it is they're aiming to achieve.
Dave and I spend a lot of time talking about, Rodney is our, we don't want to say Rodney is our favorite developer, but Rodney is one of our favorite people.
You can say that.
He's one of our favorite people. And Rodney,
my favorite.
Rodney is totally unique. And as we hear from Graham Hussey later in this session, our belief is that many developers around Canada are really, really wonderful people like Rodney. They're not all as amazing as Rodney, but they're good people.
We term them developers with a conscience.
Developers with a conscience.
They care about the
They're out there, right? And they do this work. This is their profession. This is your profession. One of the things that I think we talk about a lot is, what does it mean to be a badly behaved developer? And we talk about what it means to be a badly behaved bishop. And there are a lot of those too, or priest or congregational board member. And we'll get to that in a second. What does it look like when a church really messes things up? But when a developer messes things up, in our view, is when they hear a church say this list and they think, hold on, the developer's trying to sell them their credentials. And they hear the church saying, we want deeply affordable, which could be supportive housing, could be, they want all those things. Developers often don't want to stop that conversation and say, that all those things that you've said mean that this no longer pencils.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to have that because they want to win the deal. And that's something that often we end up, this is a place where, and maybe even here in this session, you're thinking, this is complicated, this is difficult. It's often the place where we do our hardest work, isn't it, Dave? We're saying you can't have all of those things. And by the way, don't blame the developer because they haven't created this problem, right?
And Rodney, you've said many times before that a church will, with a consultant who may not understand the process of development well, will create an RFP that then goes out.
Request for proposal.
Which is a request for, yes, get our terms straight. And no developers bid on it because it can't actually be done. So you have the list of, we want this, 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 and this, and it stays, there's no interest because you can't actually do that.
Yes.
So it's important, I think, to have that front end clarifying of objectives. And we also know the worst thing you can do, and I don't know if we want to talk about that in this session or not, but is to generate an income stream when you haven't reimagined who you are as a faith community. So now you have money coming back into the church just to prolong your death. Probably isn't the best stewardship of those funds.
I'm glad you raised it now, Dave, because as you're referencing, it's part of our session on all the bottom lines. Yeah. But this is where it comes up. And it comes up for you, Rodney, and you're in the middle trying to really help the church understand that you're good at your job, and your colleague developers around Canada, they have experience in doing this. But this is the problem, right? Is all of these bottom lines are hitting. So just let's draw us back to what happens when a church goes well. They understand what they actually want, and now they're connecting it to the proforma. They're keeping in reality. What happens? What does a badly behaved church look like? How bad can it get? And just tell us a few stories.
Let's
We'll
keep
change the
for a
names.
second on the good. Let's keep for a second on the good,
right.
because I think there are some other lessons. One of the other things I think that is good practice from a developer's point of view is actually having a point person.
Okay.
It is it's very challenging. Churches
like a
love
team or a vision team
That's right.
is focused on that.
Focused on that can deliver. As church bodies, we're not always good at making decisions, and development needs decisions to be made to be able to keep marching along. And so having, a small property committee and such that are empowered.
Yes.
To certain milestones usually that have to go back to the congregation for consultation or approval, but it can at least move that process forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms maybe now we'll go to behaving badly.
Let's do that as our first one, because that's an easy one, right? There's a few people that turn up as the committee. The committee's not been well mandated by the board. The board has no permission from the region or the diocese of the presbytery to be doing any of this.
That's right.
And then just as things start getting difficult, they change all the members of that committee and we have a whole new set of people. So
Yeah.
that's one that goes wrong a lot.
Absolutely. And struggle to make a decision, and
Or the wrong people are on that committee.
a whole host of Thursday night meetings and revolving concepts and moving affordable housing targets up and down and never getting to a conclusion.
Okay, so
that's
there's one.
That's one.
Yeah, they can't make a decision. That's a big one.
That's I think
Probably
that's
our biggest, right?
I think it is our biggest.
Yeah.
We spend so much time talking concept creation.
Yes.
But actually to say yes to move forward is very difficult.
I think that's a big one. Related to that, I think too is living in fear. Certainly,
Oh,
the
huge.
committees and such.
Yes.
Really
Yep.
not going into the process, sort of saying, you know what, if we're going to deliver the highest and best value, not just from a financial point of view, but really doing something remarkable, it's going to involve a few cracked eggs, right?
Yes.
Like development. Infill development in particular is tough. I used to joke all the time that I started my career as a lawyer.
Infill development is building where there's a lot of density, a lot of other housing, and there's a bit of space, green space next to the church, and we're filling that spot in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like the typical development pattern in Canada is on the outskirts of town. There's a farm or a chunk of forest, and that becomes a new suburb. That's still the dominant development pattern. But in the case of churches, they tend to exist within a neighborhood, and so we call that an infill development, a redevelopment. I oftentimes make the joke that I started my career as a lawyer. I wasn't unpopular enough, and so I became an infill developer. Right? So it can be a tough.
Yes, this is a densifier, a gentrifier.
Sure.
That's
right.
the
Yeah.
name
Yeah.
calling, right?
Exactly. The name calling, and now all of a sudden my garden's going to have a shadow on it and such. And that's part of the reality of doing something, of delivering homes, of delivering affordable housing, of delivering revenue streams. Whether it's a market development or a nonprofit development, neighbors oftentimes get worked up on that front. And if a congregation lives in fear too much to sort of say, you'll never get anything done.
Right. So that's an important one, because I think again, a number of churches that I'm familiar with, and their story is there was a lot of pushback from the neighborhood. So you want to be liked in the community, you want to live a mission, you want people to come into your church building, and now we've started this development process and everyone hates us.
Right.
So it does take a lot of conversations in church basements,
Right.
as you've said, to change the narrative to one of, we're not here to try and mess up the community. We're actually here to provide a resource of impact.
This is a great time to reference a study, which we'll put a link to in the notes, of 20 churches in the US who undertook affordable housing development projects.
Yeah.
Of those 20, 7 of them were sued. And almost all of those lawsuits were from their neighbors.
Yep.
This is shocking, because you think,
Yep.
hold on, we wanted transit-oriented development where people got to live near a bus stop,
Right.
because that's good for people who don't have as much money. They don't have a car.
Yep.
We want them to be near shopping. We want seniors to be. These are all the things that infill is actually meant to do.
Absolutely.
So how is it that the neighbors are now suing the church for doing this? Not in my backyard. Surely that wouldn't apply for a church doing development, right?
Right.
Well, we know that's not the case. So
Not the
there's
case.
another risk of development.
Certainly.
And that's quite something to think of 20 churches trying to do the right thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think
How many
that's
of them end up in litigation?
And I think that's a fear of a lot of churches.
That's real fear.
is If I move down this development pathway, I'm trying to love my neighbor.
Yes.
And I move down this pathway, and now my neighbors are actually ticked off at us and upset at us. And now we have to bring them into our church basement and have these conversations to try and convince them why this is good news.
Right.
And it's hard.
It is. It's
So they're
the
living-
hard work.
So living in fear is a bad thing, but it's also a real thing. And so there's that. What else?
Well, in terms of congregations behaving badly, I would say I oftentimes see it on the front end. One of the ways that they behave badly, I think, I've seen.
I am picturing right now a reality TV show. Congregations I don't know why that came into my mind. But I'm seeing the commercial and I'm like, I might watch that.
You and two others, I think. But one I've certainly seen is where a church goes out and hires a consultant, hires an architect,
Yes,
hires
say
a
this.
planning firm. They expend a lot of money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, to come up with the
What
pretty
was that
pictures.
project we did in LA? We didn't actually
right.
do the
Sure,
project,
yeah.
but $2 million.
Right.
And they had, to date, when we had met with them, had nothing done on the site.
Right. That they focus on the pretty pictures. They focus on
Yep.
good-looking renderings, site plans, charrettes and workshops, even with the
consultants,
congregation, where everyone gets
Yeah.
to lean into sort of.
I'm trying to not get angry as we go through this part because there are so many where we've seen this.
Right.
Where they call and say, we want you to spend some energy on going to meet the neighbors. You know, Dave just led a project recently where there was an indigenous group, an LGBTQ2 spirit-led group, a women-led group that were all in the neighborhood of a church that this church had never met before. And we made the case, and they did support that work, to say, we need you to make space and time to listen to those. That's just, as you know, the way we roll. And other churches where we find exactly the situation where we had one that came to us the other day, and they said, we have spent $300,000 on architect's fees. We have a shovel-ready project.
Right.
We just need help with the money. And we said, what do you mean it's shovel-ready? And what do you mean the architect? Well, the architect has told us that we need to raise the entire roof on this church by 18 inches.
Right.
And if only we do that, everything else will be answered.
Yeah, right.
And we were so upset because we thought that's wasted years of that church's time.
Absolutely.
$300,000 of their savings.
Yeah.
And it's not shovel ready. There's no community narrative.
Right.
So this issue of they've just gone and hired somebody who, that same person, when they're working in a good process and they're the violinist in the orchestra, that works well. Right?
Sure.
Well, and so-
Absolutely.
And I think with consultants, and I've heard you say this, Rodney, where they'll hire a consultant who doesn't understand development.
Mm-hmm.
So
They start with an architect.
So they
who
start,
might be a member of the congregation.
They'll use the architect who's on the board, and so now they think, oh, we're really moving forward, until it actually gets to engaging a developer, and they're like, no, you got to go back to square one. Or they work with someone who is a developer or understands that process, but doesn't understand community or congregation. And I think it's really important to have a guide or a consultant who understands the intricacies, which is why we're doing the masterclass, of how these worlds intersect. We knew I need to understand development. You also need to understand community. You also need to understand the mission that the church is trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
And to weave those together, I think, is really where the magic is.
And I would say, I'm just going to interject on that front for momentarily. You had referenced earlier, we were coming up with the list here of congregations behaving badly, but the request for proposals, the RFP on the street to find a developer partner. And one of the things I always advise, not just churches, but anyone we're doing a development project with, development is like a marriage in that
Right.
it takes years.
Yeah.
From the moment you start, it's not unusual at all for rezoning to take a couple of years.
Right.
And then it's not unusual at all for a good-sized building to take a couple of years to construct. And then if we're talking about a rental building, then we got to get that whole thing rented up, and we may decide that we're going to hold that for the following 20 years or longer, right? And so this is a very, very long process. And you wouldn't choose your spouse via an RFP. You wouldn't just put that.
I'm so glad you're saying
Wow.
You wouldn't just put it out there to sort of say, you know what, I'll go on.
Who's gonna meet my needs the most?
Exactly. I'll go on Tinder. I'll find 25 potential, and I'm just going to send them an RFP. And
let them know exactly. Here's my wishes.
Here's my wishes, and they'll come in for 25-minute pitch, and I'll choose the best one. Nobody would do it that way, right?
I'm so glad you say that.
And what's critical, what ideally you want to do, and what I certainly counsel my daughters as they are starting to enter the dating world, is to sort of say what's the most important is that you want to find people who match your values.
Yes.
And so working through a process that sort of says, we know what our values are, and who's a partner that aligns with those values.
Yes.
And then working it through from there.
So I think it's really important, if we're talking process, that a congregation knows their identity.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the values in which I uphold. Secondly, here are the objectives that we actually carry, not the laundry list. We're not going to do all 8. What are the 1 or 2 really key objectives that you want?
Key
Or at
priorities.
least the prioritization.
Key priorities.
That's right,
Key priorities. That's a better word. And then what is a best practice for a congregation in courting or in just finding a development partner? What is the best that you, or the process that you've seen to make that?
And that's where we knew this was going to be one of our bigger sessions on the course. It's where we're going to have to draw to a conclusion now, only because we promised 101, and I think we've covered that. But you can see why we need 201 and 301. This is an entire course on its own. But there are a couple of things I think we need to draw to conclusion now. One of them on this RFP process, and here's where there are a few places where we want to educate you generally, but you can see there are many ways in which we are trying to develop and how we operate.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons I think you've given an outstanding argument for why we believe the real estate brokerage portion of this needs to change. And again, another legal disclaimer, anything to do with the trade of property, the leasing, the potential sale, this is the trade of real estate. We need licensed real estate brokers in each jurisdiction where you operate to be with us. Because if it goes wrong, we do all of this work and then we simply go on one criteria, which is the highest dollar value promised in this long process, which is never going to end up the way we thought at the beginning. We can really mess up this delicate balance. So the RFP, the request for proposal, or the expression of interest, or the courting of a partner, it is truly a co-development in this case, is a brokerage activity that needs more thought. That's one. The other, and I think this is probably the place we'll conclude, is we've learned a lot not only about what is development, but we've learned more about the role of a developer. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that churches think that because they own the land and they have some smarts, and this is to you, Jeff and Jane, you're really good at what you do in your day job. That doesn't mean, therefore, that we can be, Dave and I are not developers. We don't think that you, unless you are an experienced developer, can be a developer. And really, are we talking about the conductor of an orchestra? Are we talking about a neurosurgeon? Mm-hmm. This is somebody who has experience in doing this work.
That's right.
And I suppose that's where we want to leave you today, is to say, we hope you've learned something. You've heard us talking around this issue, and you've become more confident that you know a few of the terms, and also more confident that as part of this journey, if property development, urban infill, this kind of work, building something new on your site is going to happen, we are going to need to find you are going to need to find a development partner that makes sense on this. Yeah. So we hope this has been an enjoyable session. So as we wrap this part of the conversation, Rod, we want to say thank you so much for opening this up for us.